Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fifth talk in the HX Grow webinar series. And our speaker again is Fiann Nualláin. And tonight's topic will include growing aspects, such as which way your garden is facing and which plants are suitable there. Also raised beds and also container gardening. So that's a lot, but we know it'll be very rich, as with all the other talks. And just in case there's any newcomers tonight, to mention that the talk will be 40 to 45 minutes. And if you have any questions, you may type them in the Q&A box, and we'll put the questions to Fiann at the end. Okay, Fiann, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So, yeah, tonight's topic is about kind of growing aspects. And I guess the good news is that if you're a gardener, there isn't an aspect that you can't find plants for. You know, plants have adapted to all different types of environments, different levels of shade, different levels of sun, different exposures to temperature ranges, to breezes and whatever else. So no matter what way your garden is facing, you will be able to find a rich diversity of plants to populate that space. The issue where it becomes kind of slightly complicated is when I talk about gardeners, I will talk about ornamental gardeners, and then I will talk about productive gardeners. So ornamental gardeners would be like, my dad was an ornamental gardener. He grew roses, he had a rockery, he liked climbers. If it flowered, that's what he was into. My granddad was a productive gardener. He had his own rhubarb, his own gooseberries. He grew his own potatoes, cabbages, kales, all that sort of stuff. So if you're a productive gardener, as in you are growing to feed yourself, and I guess lately we can include in the productive garden range, if you're growing to feed the bees, or if you're growing to feed the birds and the wildlife, then your aspect can have an implication there on possibly limiting the range of what you can do. So if you're looking to grow your own food crops, you need at least 6 to 8 hours of daylight exposure on those crops during the day. Now, when we say daylight, really we mean sunshine. Daylight, I mean, the light will spill into your garden anyway, but you might only get 4 hours or 2 hours or 3 hours on that raised bed or garden plot or whatever, and that's not going to enable a broad range of vegetables to do their thing, and it's definitely not going to be able to enable a broad range of fruits to do their thing. So again, if you're looking to cultivate plants that feed the bees again, those kind of pollen rich plants, those plants that emit the fragrance to bring pollinators in the first place, again, they're in the range of the kind of 6 to 8 hours in full sun. Now, bees will find shady plants, so, you know, we don't have to worry too much. But in terms of feeding birds, plants that tend to bear fruit, which is what we're looking for really for the birds. I mean, when you're gardening for birds, you want perch opportunities where they can come and they can land on the branches, and then from those branches they can pick off the insects and weed seeds and stuff that they generally eat off. But when it gets into winter time, really what we're looking to do is we're looking to grow on berries that have a high protein content that will get those birds through the winter. That maybe those birds at the end of summer, the start of autumn, will bulk up on their protein before they head off to Canada or South America or the edges of Spain or Morocco or wherever they're emigrating to, or that the ones that are staying build up their fat reserves to be able to get through a kind of a sparse feeding winter time. So for that sort of stuff, again, your aspect has an impact, because where do you place your bird box or your insect hotel? So if you place your bird box facing into the sun, you think, oh, that's nice, it'll be a real warm space, the birds will come and nest in. But the bird, every time it has to leave that nest, is facing out into bright light, and it would perceive that as being a really bad location, because it doesn't know if there's an owl or a predator outside of that. It's kind of blinded by leaving. So your bird box and your insect hotels, you want to space them more in the shade. stuff like hedgehog boxes as well, anything to do with wildlife. You want to give them kind of corners and crevices that's more suitable for them, feeling like that they're hidden away. Their home is their castle in terms of, that they want a defense mechanism against being predated against. So while you would place bird boxes and various other big pieces of equipment, including like bird feeders and bird baths, because if it's out in the full exposure, psychologically those birds are on alert for the fact that they may be predated upon. But the plants that you want to grow to feed them, you need them in full sun. So the aspect is kind of important there. So if we're growing for wildlife, we kind of want more sun than shade. If we're growing for ourselves, we definitely want more sun than shade. If we're just growing to have an ornamental, beautiful aesthetic garden that we can go out and garden in every day and enjoy, then the only time really where aspect becomes a consideration is, where do you want to place your bench that you have your morning cup of coffee or your afternoon glass of wine, or where you go to read your book, So in terms of aspect, really if you think about it, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So when you think of it in terms of, an east facing garden versus a west facing garden, well, an east facing garden will have sun more in the morning time, and a west facing garden will have sun more in the evening, late evening. So the issue there then is, if you want to have your orange juice or your breakfast in the morning, well, then you really want to place your seat that's facing east. If you want to have it as a kind of a, where you're going to put your fire pit, or where you're going to put your late evening barbecue, or where you just might want to just sit out and even read a book with lights and wherever else, that's more your garden that's facing west. So people always talk about this thing of like south facing, north facing. Most gardens really are one or the other, but they're leaning on either an easterly direction or a westerly direction. Really what happens there is that it's not too complicated. If your garden is facing south, it's facing into the sun, it gets sun pretty much all day. If your garden is facing north, it's facing away from the sun, it's more shade. Now, it still will get ample light to grow what you want to grow. The kind of issue there is that, if it's south facing and easterly, say it's southeasterly, that means it will get the bulk of the sun from very early in the morning right away until mid-evening, late evening, maybe even all day until it eventually goes dark. The issue with that is there's a whole range of plants you can grow in that environment, and that's brilliant for fruit and vegetables. But the complications may be, if there are no shade, what can happen there is, even with vegetables, is that the vegetables may feel under too much stress, that they're not just getting their 6 to 8 hours, but they're getting their 10, 11 hours. And some vegetables can bolt. That means they want to go to flower and set their seeds because they're feeling that they're under stress and they're going to die off. It also may mean that what you're having to look at is think about irrigation systems, because the garden is going to be evaporating off water all the time. And last week, the episode is up there somewhere. You can click on that and look at the different watering techniques and saving water. But if your garden is south facing and it's leaning towards the east, it means it's getting the maximum amount of light throughout the day, which means it needs a lot more attention in watering than if your garden is facing any other particular aspect. Now, within that, you can always, when you think about gardening and dividing the garden up into rooms, you can throw a bit of trellising or an arbor across. You can plant maybe a hedge. It can be an edible hedge. It can be a native wildlife hedge, which again will feed the birds and, host a whole lot of insects that birds and other wildlife kind of feed off. And you can create kind of pockets and spaces in the garden that reflect and cast shades onto other aspects of the garden, which means that, if you find that, your leeks or your cabbages are going over too quickly, well, then a shade divide is a great technique to do. In the episode where we were talking about kind of, allowing light around the garden, one of the great things that you can do is you can get just aluminium foil, your kitchen tin foil, and you can paste it onto cardboard or hardwood, marine wood, and you can use those as reflectors around the garden to be able to cast light. Now, I often do that with fruit gardening because my gardening doesn't get the sun all day. So, you know, at the end of the day, you can move them around, but at the end of the season to get the fruit to really ripen up, I can place those in behind. So there's corners of my garden where the wall is painted black because I want it to absorb the heat, and I want the vegetables and the plants that are grown in front of that to kind of to benefit from the fact that, you know, the heat is taken away into the wall. Other sections, there's red brick wall that will reflect off the heat all night, which makes it's like your radiators that give off heat in the evening. So, and then there's other sections of the garden where the wall is painted a white or a magnolia or a cream color, and that's because I want the light reflected back into the plants that are there, because they require more light than that space is. So even if your aspect is a very strict north by east or north by west or south by east or whatever, there's still things that you can do in terms of how you design your garden and what you place in your garden to manipulate that. So whatever aspect you have, there's a way around being, you know, having a full potential garden in that space. I guess one of the things too is that, you know, even if you were to say to me, oh, I have a south-facing garden, because you take out the compass and it says it's south-facing, that doesn't account for what's over the wall. You know, so a tree in a neighbor's garden, or, you know, a factory behind you, or a tall building, or somebody's extension can all cast shade pockets in the garden. So in a way, no matter, you know, like I often talk about kind of microclimates, that your neighbor's garden 2 doors down may flower at a different time to yours. That can be because of how they're watering, that can be because of the shade that's there, that can be because of their soil condition. It's the same really in terms of aspect, because even though you could have a whole row of houses all south facing, depending on what way shade is being cast into the garden by surrounding buildings, the south facing doesn't make a difference. So what I recommend for everybody to do is to kind of make a shade map. So that's really, you know, you get up in the morning and you get a little sheet of paper and you mark out your garden and stick in where the shed is, stick in where your seed is, and look out, you know, 9 or 10 o'clock, look out, see where the shade pockets are, and literally shade in where your shade, where you can visibly see the shade. And then do it again at 2 o'clock, do it again maybe at 5 o'clock. We're getting into the later nights, so you should be able to do it at 7 or 8 o'clock. And you get to see the picture of how the shade moves through the garden. So anywhere there's a shade pocket, that means then naturally you're able to grow on shady plants, things like hostas and aqualegias, hydrangeas, ferns, all that sort of stuff. And some of the foods that like a little bit more shade, less sunshine. So things like cabbages and kales and all that, they like a lot of light, but they don't like a lot of heat. So having something like that where you're getting portions of dapple shade, and we're not talking deep shades, just dapple shade throughout the garden, they can go there. And then you'll see where your sunny zones are. They're the zones that aren't going to be shaded in at all. And that's where you have your broad range of any plant. Now, if you're purely into your ornamental garden, again, you have this map. You'll see where your shade is. You'll know your portion of shade or your pockets of shade through the garden at the times of the day. Your local garden centre will give you a climber for a north-facing wall, climber for a south-facing wall. There's no problem there in sourcing, you know, what you want to get to grow in that particular environment. Gardening is all about modifying your environment to make sure that it matches with the plant. I always say, don't go against nature, go with nature. There's no point trying to grow a sunny plant in dapple shade. It will perform enough, but if it wants to be in full sun, that's where it's really going to perform. So I'd rather grow it in a pot and move it around the garden even 2 or 3 times a day, or move it from one part of the year down further in the garden or to a different aspect. Even though there's more effort in that, at least I know that plant is going to perform and do what it's meant to do, and bring in whatever pollinators and give me whatever harvest I get from it. Even if it's just a rose that I love the flower of, that's a harvest of joy in itself. So that's worth the while moving that around, rather than planting it in a static space where it's not going to get what it needs. So depending on your level of interest and how involved you want to get, there are ways around all of the different varying aspects. I find always seems like a really scary thing, because you think, oh my God, I'm after buying this house and it's now such and such facing, and here's the complications I have. It's not a complication. It's just the aspect of your garden that you're going to garden to conform with. So if you're in shades, grand, you'll be growing shady plants from here on in. If you're in full sun, you won't be growing shady plants, you'll be growing full sun. But if you want to modify it, you can. Now, it's easier to modify into shade because you can construct, stick up a trellis or wherever, you can construct an area, you can plant a hedge or a shrub, and then you can underplant. You know, forest planting is where you plant a tree and then underneath it you plant a shrub, and then underneath your shrubs, moving more out into the sun, you plant your kind of herbaceous perennials and your annuals, and that creates an ecosystem in itself. The tree shades the subshrub, and the subshrub shades the other plants. In terms of even when you do that in a sunny aspect where those plants are getting a good blast of sun, what you're doing there is you're still protecting from sheltering winds and various sort of stuff, because aspect isn't just about light, it's also about heat, temperature, and shelter. So a garden that's south facing, apart from getting lots of light, it's going to build up lots of heat. And it's going to build up lots of heat from spring on earlier. So if your garden is south facing, some of your crops may come in 2 or 3 weeks earlier than somebody around the corner who's north facing. But somebody who's north facing may catch some of the more harsher winds later in the year as well. So they may need to be thinking about protecting with fleece at a much earlier stage. Some of us don't even think about fleece until it gets to Halloween. If you're in cold and you're in shade and you're getting a lot of breeze, you may need to be thinking about fleece the ending of August, the start of September. So it does have an impact on the cultivation techniques that we employ, but all we're doing is we're trying to keep one step ahead, no matter what we're cultivating, in terms of pests and diseases, in terms of climatic conditions, and every now and then there's a little tweak you can make to kind of boost something along and keep it going and keep it ticking over. So breeze and that sort of stuff, that's also in terms of how your garden is facing. Now, you see, there's no universal rules for this, because like I'm saying, you know, you might have part of the factory or part of a tall building behind you, 2 doors up, doesn't have that. So what happens is that factory that may be casting a level of shade, or the new apartment block, or the neighbor's extension, or the tree in the park, whatever it is that's casting the shade, that's also cutting down on kind of wind chill factors and stuff like that. So the blockage or the obstacle that's there may actually have a benefit too, in terms of helping extend the season of the garden, or helping prevent wind rock, even blocking out patterns of rain and sorts of stuff, you know. It's only when the rain is coming straight down we all get it. When the rain is coming at an angle, we don't all get it, because it hits other buildings, it hits other structures, it hits trees before it gets into us. So, you know, your aspects will have pros and cons. The best thing to do is to do your kind of your shade map. At least you know what you can grow, and it's specific to your site. That's not really going to change unless new buildings come up or old buildings kind of come down. As you grow your garden and mature your garden, and maybe you might put in some arbors, maybe you might choose to plant some trees, maybe you might plant an apple tree or a pear tree in a nice sunny corner. That sunny corner, as that tree matures, well, that's going to become less of a sunny corner. So you always have to be thinking as well in terms of, okay, if I'm modifying this space, in 10 years time, what am I modifying it to? So the reason why I wanted to mix kind of hanging baskets and containers in with this is because that's all relevant. You know, there's no point in setting up, okay, here's my productive beds with my 5 raised beds in a row, and then against that wall you plant, you know, a horse chestnut tree or an apple tree, and it shades out those beds in 5, 6, 7 years time, and you're thinking, oh my God, I've nowhere else in the garden to do it. I would rather suffer a yield of fruit to be lower and have it in a more shadier corner of the garden than have it blocking out my productive patch. If you're an ornamental gardener, then it doesn't really matter, because if you had sun-loving plants underneath that tree, you just get to swap them out for shade-loving plants, and you still get to produce all sorts of flowers and enjoy the garden and get your hands dirty and get stuck in, and so your aspect is no obstacle to a fabulous time in the garden. It's no obstacle to aesthetics. It may only be an obstacle to crops. And next week we look at kind of crop diversity and different stuff that you can grow in your garden and so forth. It's not too much of a hassle to literally nip into your local garden centre and say what's good for a shady corner, what's good for a semi-shaded corner. You don't even need to get into specifics to say, well, it's shady between 9 and 5. Now, the only thing is, if it's shady between 9 and 10 and then it's in full sun, it's not shady. It's a full sun garden. So that's why I say when you're doing your map, do it at several periods throughout the day. And it's like the Venn diagrams. If stuff overlap, you go, well, that's definitely the shady spot. Maybe that's where you want to have your breakfast. So in my garden, I don't want to be in full sun all the time. I'm constantly getting sunburned, constantly getting bitten, constantly getting stung. If I want a little bit of peace in the garden, I'd rather sit in the shady corner than out being stressed in the full sun. But that's just me. Maybe you're a sun lover and that's really what you want the garden for. I feel like I'm in it enough hours of the day that I don't really need to be kind of maximizing the sunshine sort of stuff. Later in the year, when it gets to kind of September, October, I appreciate the sun then, because it boosts my serotonin levels and all of that sort of stuff. So I'm happy to let the sun kind of medicate me at that time of the year. But between now and then, thank you. I'll sit in the shade and, have a cup of coffee there and survey the garden and see what needs to be done. So the next thing then is, in terms of mixing in stuff like your hanging baskets, your containers, your raised beds. The idea there is that's how another way of you modifying the garden and benefiting from whatever aspect is that you do have, right? So in terms of raised beds, if we're, most people who grow in raised beds would be productive gardeners. They're not really grown for ornamental purposes. The raised beds are there because they want their 4 or their 5 or their 6 or their 10 beds in a row so that they can do a thing called crop rotation. So crop rotation, we've spoken about it, but I'll just briefly cover it again. Crop rotation is where the plants that you grow in this bed this year, certain things happen within the soil, as in it takes out a certain amount of nutrients, maybe certain pests and diseases are attracted to that plant that are, will lay the next generation in the soil and will stay there. So by you, say, for example, your potatoes are heavy feeders. They will strip a lot out of that soil. They may attract wireworm and certain types of beetles that will lay eggs in it. By you not planting in that bed next year, by you planting your potatoes in the bed one up, well, then all of the pests and diseases are in last year's bed or bed number 1, and your potatoes are now in bed number 2. And then next year they go into bed number 3, and the next year they go into bed number 4. And that means that you can add the fertility into what's following. So for example, your bed 1 that was potatoes last year, this year now it's been pretty much stripped of all its nutrients. You can either at this time of the year, or maybe a couple of months ago, dig in a lot of manure and you can grow whatever you want in it. But very often what happens in crop rotation is that people would choose to go, okay, I'm going to work with nature, not against nature. This is a poor soil now. What grows in poor soil? Okay, I'll put my alliums in. I'll put my leeks, my shallots, my onions, my garlic. They love a poor soil. They're going to thrive really well. And the manure that I got in, okay, I'm going to put that in bed 3 and let that be breaking down so that when the potatoes go in next year, that's going to be ready for the potatoes to go in next year. So the crop rotation is a way of managing soil fertility, and it's a way of keeping one step ahead of diseases. Lots of people go out and they get their bed system. Most of them is a 4-bed system, but if you're really into growing, you need more
Hi there. Sorry for that brief interruption there. We're trying to get this sorted on the technical side. So if you just bear with us for a moment. Thank you.
Okay, sorry folks, technical difficulties. We're back. So where was I at? Yeah, I was telling you how I made my millions and met my wife. No. So in terms of with your raised beds, what you're trying to do is you're trying to manage your fertility and you're trying to keep ahead of diseases. The great thing about raised beds is that, you know, the key to success with raised beds is your location and your spacing. So this is where aspect creeps in, and this is why they're kind of pushed together in this kind of talk. Your raised beds, again, they're going to look, you will have done your shade map. You're looking for something that gets the longest amount of sunshine. So your raised beds may not be lined up side by side. You may not have a single strip where all 4 beds are. They may have to be manipulated at different points around the garden, so that you can maximize the sun in the day. Because again, some people would get sun first thing in the morning, and you know that those 2 beds that are in that particular zone of the garden, they're going to get 4, 5, maybe 6 hours of sunshine. Then because of a building or a tree, it's going to be evening time before the sunshine moves back around into another section of the garden, and you can place your other 2 raised beds there. If you're able to place the raised beds against a particular sunny strip of the garden or straight down the middle of the garden and maximize the full amount of sunshine, even better. But don't be worried that you can't get regimented, that they can't be in a straight line. Don't think about the aesthetics, think about the productivity that you're going to harvest from those beds. The great advantage of raised beds as well means that in a way you're kind of you're combating some of the complications if you don't have a perfect aspect. So for example, if your garden is north facing, or if your garden is particularly facing west, then they can tend to be cooler gardens. North facing is very often in shade, very often gets the chill wind. West facing, because it doesn't get the sun until the evening, it's cooler all day. It doesn't really heat up until late in the evening. And by the time it does start to heat up, sure, it's night time. And if we've no cloud cover, all of the heat is evaporating. So by having raised beds are a way of kind of cheating on ground frost and cooler soil temperatures. because the bed is raised up that little bit higher, that it's off the ground. It's away from those chills and cool air that will gather in lower pools. So by having raised beds in the garden, even if you wanted to be an ornamental gardener, you know, and you're putting in kind of walls or terraces or long wooden raised beds, really what's happening there is you're creeping it up, you're getting it closer to the top surface where the sun is coming down, so it's closer to sunshine, it's getting more warmth, and it's away from cool pools of air that may form underneath it. That's brilliant if you're growing stuff like strawberries. You know, I grow bilberries and a lot of my fruit stuff in containers because I can move them when I need to move them at different times of the year. But it's also, they also have the advantage of being up. Now, the only drawback, as we spoke about last week, is the fact that you become more responsible for the watering, because if your plant is in a container, it has no access to the water table that's in the soil, no access to the moisture there. So it's only the moisture you've put it in. And it doesn't matter how often it rains and stuff, you still have to keep an eye on your containers to make sure that you're not letting them dry out too much, or that you're not keeping them too soggy. When it comes to a raised bed, eventually those roots will move down and they will find the water table below, but they don't have as immediate access to that reservoir of water in the soil as if you plant at your natural ground level. So your parsnip or your carrot with the taproot will sink down a lot quicker, a lot faster into the natural water table in your layer of soil than if you're growing it in a raised bed. But your raised bed, because you're able to amend that soil, because you have to fill the box that you put it in, or the terraced wall that you put it in. So you're filling that. We spoke last week about substrates and soil types. You're filling that with really good quality, possibly well sieved mixture of compost and sand. So it's not hitting stones, it's not hitting unusual pockets of air or slate or moisture retentiveness. It's an even field all the way across, and you'll get a more perfectly formed root system. So if that's carrots and parsnips, that's brilliant because they'll be straighter, they won't be forked, they won't have all little roots coming out of them. And if that's cabbages and kales and stuff that like a nice anchoring into the soil, and they want an even spread out to absorb moisture at their own level, then that's really beneficial for them too. If that's potatoes and crops where, you know, you might be growing okra or wherever you have your other types of root crops that you want to be digging up, that's brilliant for them too, because they come up out of the soil a lot easier than if they're buried down in heavy clay soil. So the advantage there with the raised beds is you can really manipulate your garden a hell of a lot more efficiently than if you're just trying to dig into your original soil. I mean, even when I was talking previously about the difference between kind of ericaceous and calcareous, between limey soil and acidic soil, you know, when you're trying to do that in your ground, in the pocket of it, it's much more difficult, because you're only, you know, you're digging a trench and you're trying to make this more acidic so you can grow your blueberries or your azaleas or your rhododendrons or whatever. But the whole rest of the garden is pushing in on that, and it, you know, the acidity is leaching out, the alkalinity is leaching in. When you have the raised beds, because it's above this sideward movement, you know, your stuff can leach down, but not so much can come up. So, you know, the thickness of the plank that you put in of the borders around was traditionally kind of, you know, 2 feet, because that's enough to grow everything in. So you could technically grow alkaline plants on a bog in a 2 feet plant, and they're not going to be acidified, and the roots aren't going to hit the bog and shrivel up and come back. So traditionally, you're kind of your 2 foot planking space. Now, to be ergonomic, you know, if you have a bad back, or if you're a wheelchair user, you may want to come up higher. You might want to come up 4 feet, 5 feet. You know, that's not a bother either. It just means that, you know, you've a hell of a lot more soil to go in and fill. But I mean, the bottom of it can be lined with bricks, with other bits of wood, with, you know, other salvageable material, which will also create a heat reservoir there as they heat up throughout the year. And then you have all your substrates and your top surface of soil on top. Now, of course, you can grow a raised bed and dig some garden soil in. I mean, some of us come in and their gardens and there's a slope at the back and it's all this soil that was left over from when the builders came in and built the communal wall around the area, and they just dump soil in a deposit, and we have ample soil to use. Based on last week's talk, I still advocate that you add in manure, that you add in compost and whatever else to just improve it. But coming up at a height, you can come up at any height. So the other thing with cheating aspect as well is that I have a wall that's partially shaded. It's because my neighbor has a big extension, so it's partially shaded for most of the day, and then later in the evening it gets a lot of warmth and a lot of heat. What I do there is I have what I call pallet gardening, which is where I've just gotten pallets and I've been able to slip down between the grooves, grow bags, pierce holes in them, and in that I will grow my lettuce and salad crops, and later on I will grow strawberries and trailing tomatoes. So because I can put them up at a height, I can push them up that wall, get them closer to the sun, get them more sun for longer in the day. If I was growing them at ground level, they wouldn't get any warmth or sunshine till about 4 o'clock in the evening. By pushing them up the wall, they get them at 10 or 11. So they're still getting their 6, 7, 8 hours worth of photosynthesizing and maturing and building up their flavor, because I've chosen to grow them up at a height and not on the ground. So this is what I mean about aspects not really being a difficulty. There's plenty of cheats that you can do for that. And hanging baskets are again another great thing that you can do. You don't have to go out salvaging pallets out of skips. You can get hanging baskets, put the brackets on the wall, and you can have your line of herbs or trailing tomatoes or trailing strawberries, and away you go. So again, you're responsible for the watering of those, so that can be an issue, but you may want to set up a drip hose or something, depending on how you feel about your garden. My kind of front garden is ornamental grasses and kind of wildflowers and that sort of stuff. It has its own aesthetic. That's grand. It looks after itself. I don't have to worry about it too much. Maybe weed it, maybe tidy it every now and then. The neighbors don't complain too much. The back garden is very much a productive garden. There's a polytunnel, there's raised beds, there's pallets up on the wall. It's not the most aesthetic garden in the world, but it's not meant to be. It's there to supply me with food and with herbs and with plants that I'm trialing for other things that I'm working on, whether it's a bloom garden or a community project or whatever. So the fact that I'm able to have kind of an interchangeable garden where I can move stuff around, I find that invaluable. And lots of stuff I grow in containers, because again, I'm trying to move them around the garden at different points. Because I have the luxury of being a gardener, I can be in the garden and do that. If you're off to the office in the morning and you're not back into the evening, well then you don't want to be trying to move your pot of chives 3 times in the day. You're not going to be able to do that. So your chives that like warm all of the time, maybe what you got to think about is, well, maybe I can't actually grow them in the back garden. Maybe I can grow them on the front of the house in a window box, and they have lovely, purple mauve flowers, so that when they come in the flower, they actually look pretty. They can be grown amongst thyme. They can be grown amongst a butter yellow oregano, so that your aestheticness, your creativity, the prettiness of what you grow can also be productive. And it's just a case of where you're going to position that and how you can actually use that. The stuff, there's wildflowers and various other bits and pieces that grow in my front garden amongst the grasses that I would harvest throughout the year as well, like nigella. I would use that as a spice, but it's there in the garden to feed the bees, to bring the butterflies in, to be a pretty attractive blue flower in amongst other stuff, but I still get to harvest it for its edibility. So that's the thing. You can trick aspects and you can play with aspects. The other thing then, in terms of your raised beds, I'm talking about spacing in terms of like what your height is, how far it is off the ground, but spacing in terms of how far apart they are is also key. Now it's key in only in the level of you being able to walk it properly. So traditionally the space between each raised box would be 2. Now your raised box can be any length they want and any width apart. Traditionally the idea was that they wouldn't be more than kind of 1.5 meters, because that's enough arm's reach to be able to get in from either side to weed and harvest from the middle. I've seen raised beds that look like a queen size bed, or it's a big double bed, and you're thinking, how did they get into the middle of that? They're going to have to step on in, or they're going to have to get a long hoe or a long rake to do it. So if they're narrow enough that you can put your arm's reach in from either side, then it means it's a quick way of maintaining what has to be maintained. Don't fall for the trick of thinking, oh, the bigger the raised bed, the more cabbages or the more kale or the more asparagus I'll have. Think about how you can work it each year. And again, like that, because of crop rotations, you're moving stuff along. I mentioned asparagus, which is a perennial vegetable. You plant it once, you harvest it often. Maybe after 20 years, you dig it up and you split it up and you rejuvenate it. The same with kind of rhubarb and that sort of stuff. To keep a section of the garden separate for those sort of things, for cardoons and globe artichokes. And again, because they're in the ground, you can, modify your soil level, get it as enriched as you possibly can with humus and compost, and then leave them there, let them take away. And you don't have to bother about them. And that frees up beds so that you're not trying to think all of the time, where does this fit in? The other one is legumes. Legumes are peas and beans. They fix nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil. They can be grown anywhere. You don't have to keep them in a crop rotation solely for peas and beans, because they're grown in different spots. The whole idea is that you don't grow the same plant in the same spot 2 years consecutively, because they may have a pest or disease soil borne in that area and you want to keep them a leap ahead. The rest is about managing the fertility stuff. But the spacing, of your beds, of how you can get in and pull out that weed or plant that or harvest that berry or whatever it is you need to do with it, that's about walkability. But the space between each box is also about walkability. Do you need to kneel on the ground to do your gardening? So if you need to kneel on the ground, well, then it needs to be the length of your knee to your foot before you hit off the next edge of the box or the next scaffold and plank in your raised bed. Otherwise, it's just going to be uncomfortable gardening from here on in. Are you growing on a bigger scale, and do you want to be able to push a wheelbarrow up and down between each of your raised beds as well? So while the traditional was generally kind of 2 to 4 feet between it, don't be afraid to go a bit wider if needs be. I know it feels like that the space between the beds, there's never anything really grown in them. I mean, you could try growing chamomile, you could try growing, low grown, maybe clovers and that sort of stuff. You can harvest the clovers, which are nitrogen fixers, to make nitrogen rich fertilizer. You can harvest the chamomile, which I constantly talking about in terms of all its antibacterial benefits for cleaning your tools, for washing out seed trays, for using as a tea, cold tea over your seedlings to stop them from getting damping off disease and all that sort of stuff. You can just have grass between it that you can mow. You can just have mulch between it. You can have sand between it. You can have slabs between it. I know it seems like it's a waste of space going further out, but it's not. You will gain in the long run by being able to garden comfortably. There's nothing worse than going out and having a really productive year, but you felt awkward, you hurt your back, you scraped your knee, and you get fed up with the project. So allow the space out between it. Even if it's slabs between it, that's fine. If the slabs on the ground, there's not weeds. So if the slabs on the ground, even when the water, when it rains, the runoff will go down along the side cracks and it'll go into where your plants are. So there isn't really a drawback in how you treat the space between your raised beds. And you can lay your containers out there too if you want, even if it's a long window box or a round container. And when you come to do the gardening, you just lift it up and you put it on the side of your sleeper or the side of your scaffold and plank. There are many companies now that make ready-made kit-formed raised beds. And they're great because they tend to be not kind of tannalized wood or not wood that's treated with creosote or whatever. So, you know, you're fine to garden straight in. Sometimes with the sleepers or the scaffolding planks, they can have a chemical element to them that's going to take 3 or 4 years to dissipate out into the soil. So what do you do with the first 3 or 4 years worth of crops, you know? So unless you're getting really aged material, and you know that everything is gone and cleared out of it. You know, you used to get railway sleepers and you just smell creosote, you know, from 10 miles away. You can go into some of the DIY places now and hardware stores and get what's a sleeper, but really it's just a plain plank of wood in a sleeper shape, and there's no chemicals involved there. So again, it's that thing of kind of thinking about, if I'm going to grow my own food, well, the environment that I'm growing my own food in isn't just about sunshine and water or access to rain. It's also about, well, what's the quality of soil that it needs, but what's the surroundings, what's connected in with that soil that can have an impact on it. The other thing that people often do with container gardens is they put hoops over it, and then they can put in sheets of plastic or sheets of fleece. It can be literally a hula hoop in half, or it can be, you can get it wire containers. And again, there's professional kits and all this sort of stuff. And that extends your growing season throughout the year. It also means that if you are kind of, you know, north facing or more westerly, and you're not getting as much heat as somebody who's east facing or on the southward lee of the garden, it means that you can put fleece over to keep the heat in. It means that you can put plastic sheeting over when the sun is there to act like a mini polytunnel to bring stuff on. So again, these are the little bits of tweaks and tricks that you can actually do. But, you know, for me, making the map, the first thing, you know, if I was starting a new garden in the morning, where do I want to sit? Where do I want to have my breakfast? Where do I want to be out in the evening? That's it. And then every other consideration is, where can I maximize the food and the herbs that I want to grow for myself? The aesthetics then after that come secondary. By placing pots and containers around, you can grow ornamental shrubs in the spots. You can shield off areas. You can put crisscross trellising in and paint them a lovely color, blue or pink or gray or whatever shade you're kind of into, and you can create little gardening rooms and deposits. And behind that, well, you know, that can be your cucumbers can even be grown up that, and it still looks attractive this side where you're sitting down, but on the other side, it's ultimately productive. I like the aesthetics of upcycled stuff. So pallets, sleepers, scaffolding boards, all that sort of stuff. I think it kind of adds to the garden, especially when you have terracotta pots and all that sort of stuff. And then the terracotta pots brings me back again to kind of aspect in terms of, if you are north facing or if you are more westerly, then frost hits earlier and stays longer. So not every pot that you purchase is frost hardy. And over time, a lot of the terracotta pots, because they're porous and they expand and contract, they can crack in it with a bad frost, or they can start to flake and chip off at the sides. Again, there's only an aesthetic consideration to that. But some of the pots that look glazed and look lovely, and you might think, oh, this is great, this is a real brilliant investment, I'm going to have this for a long, long time. You might only get a year out of it. So I'd always say, before you make those expensive purchases in the garden centre, make sure you ask the person who's ringing the till, is this frost hardy? Because I want to have this for 4 or 5 years. There's no point spending €50 on something to grow tomatoes in, and next year it's shattered, you know. So that's kind of the core part of aspect, the core part of raised beds. You know, your care regime is tailored to the plant, you know. So, you know, if you are matching your plant to the environment that's there already, and even though I keep talking about how we can amend it, if it's shady and poor soil, then you grow something that likes to be shady and in poor soil. If it's full sun and poor soil, full sun and poor soil. If it's full sun and rich soil, full sun and rich soil. So, you know, there's a plant for every aspect. There's a plant for every garden. I know this was kind of heavy on the kind of productive side of stuff. But again, you know, where we're growing for bees, where we're growing for the birds, where we want an aesthetic type of look in the garden. That's also important too, that those plants are grown in the environment that they're going to get. The wildflower meadows, I mean, just think about them. Where are they? They're always out in full sun. Now you can get wildflower mixes for woodland, but that's, do you have a woodland? Now maybe the shade that's cast into your garden is mimicking a woodland, so you can then put that mix, sow that mix in, and still be able to feed the pollinators, still be able to bring other wildlife, other insects into that ecosystem that you've created. But you're not trying to have a traditional wildflower meadow in a front garden or a back garden that's in shade for more than 2/3 of the day. You know, you're having to think outside the box and do something different. And if that's the environment that you have, then don't just think that your wildflower meadow, because that's all we're kind of hearing this year, is like as if your wildflower meadow is going to save all the bees and all the birds and all the butterflies. They need other habitats too. I mean, butterflies need a basking space to recharge their energy up, you know. So even something like a rockery doesn't seem like it would do much for butterflies at all, but you can put, like, you know, your lobelia and your sedums, and there's lots of alpine rockery type plants that produce nectar early, that have long corollas, long tubes that the butterflies can sink their tongue down into, that bees don't visit, so they're tailor-made for the butterflies. But they also have the rocks that they can bask on, let the sun recharge their energy, and off they can flit and fly away. So you may think that's a low diversity. Oh God, the rockery, that's so 1970s and it doesn't really do anything. It does a hell of a lot, you know. And there are other insects that are there underneath the stones, different types of beetles and wherever else. So, you know, the wildlife will find its way in. And there's wildlife again for every aspect. So just like at the start when I was saying where you place your bird boxes and that sort of stuff, a shady garden is not going to deprive you of much. A full sunny garden is not going to deprive you of anything at all. So you can walk your garden around whatever conditions that's there for it. So I'm just wondering how we fixed for time.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, Fiann. Actually, I think we'll take some questions now if you're ready. Just to thank you again that you've covered a multitude there. It was fascinating. So let's move on to the questions there. One of them is, if you planted carrot seeds, how long would you give for them to show up? In other words, when would you reseed?
Yeah, if you planted carrot seeds and they haven't done anything, any seed really, if it's not up in 21 days, it ain't coming up. Most seeds will come up, will at least make a showing of something, will start to germinate within 5 to 7 days. Then it just depends on how far they have to push their way up through their soil to put their cotyledons on, their true leaves and their force leaves, and become seedlings and move on. So you really want to be seeing something within 7 to 10 days, some sort of break on the soil surface and some sort of greenery. Again, there are ones that take a little bit longer, but if there's nothing within 3 weeks, then it hasn't germinated. And that may be a variety of different reasons. It may be that it didn't get watered enough to break the layer on the outside of the seed to actually go into germination. And it may just mean that instead of resown, you just need to water and move it into more light or more heat. Give it another 5 or 6 days, and then if it hasn't, then it's dud seed. Now, by dud seed, it just means that the seed can lose its viability. You know, if you think of kind of poppies and weeds and stuff like that, they have a viability of 90 years. Where you think of most edible food, it has a viability of 1 year to 2. And it's just, it's how we've bred stuff. We've often bred for productiveness rather than longevity. You know, I often think about kind of sweet peas and stuff. That sweet peas for years were bred to produce brighter flowers, bigger flowers, but we bred out the scent. You know, for me as a kid, the sweet peas were all about the scent. And then by the time I became an adult, sweet peas were all about these kind of big, showy, blousy plants that had no fragrance, you know. So we have to be careful as well, and I'll probably talk about that next week in terms of kind of, you know, diversity and selection of plants. What is it we're actually trying to achieve with the plant? But the carrot seeds, yeah, if it hasn't come up, get a new packet. They don't store that well, especially if you've collected them yourself. You know, they're also biennial too, so that if you're looking to collect them yourselves, you need to let them flower. You need to let them come up, put their leaves on, and then flower the second year, which is when you would collect the seeds then. And then you would have 1 to 2 years of keeping those seeds in an envelope in a drawer before you could sow them again.
Okay, thanks. Next question. What is the best aspect for a greenhouse to optimize its value?
Yeah, see, greenhouses are a tricky one, right? Because now I have a polytunnel, and I have a polytunnel that's in partial shades. And the reason why I have the polytunnel in partial shade is in other places I've lived and other places I've worked, the polytunnels have ended up in full sun. And the same where a glass house heats up even more than the plastic, because the plastic has some solar refraction. It reflects some of the sunshine back, where the glass house lets the sunshine through. And the thing is, if you have your greenhouse in full sun for 5 to 6 to 7 to 10 hours of the day, really what you're doing is it's like holding a magnifying glass. You're literally creating this kind of kill zone for the plants that's inside of it. You're going to burn them all off. And you can get shading where you can either paint like a whitewash on, or you can get actual shading that comes in terms of lats, or even like a fleece thing where you're trying to create a net curtain effect so that it doesn't overheat. The thing is, a greenhouse is great now for getting all your seeds going. By the time it gets into summer, it's often too hot for gardeners to be in. So your greenhouse, you need to nuance what way you're looking to, how often you want to use it. Like a lot of people buy greenhouses and they want it literally to be an alpine house. It doesn't need to be in full sun. It just needs to get a decent quality of light. So that can even be in a shady corner of the garden. Once it's getting the aspect of the light, you can grow on a rich range of plants. If you wanted it to grow orchids, so you have some specific plant collection that you want to cultivate, again, it doesn't need to be in bang in the middle of full sun. And if it's bang in the middle of full sun, its square footage that it's taken up would be more productive given over to a raised bed or a traditional garden plot. Because if you're only using your greenhouse to start off your seeds, grow your plants on to plant them out, then the glass house itself is enough protection from the elements in spring, and everything that's in it goes out in summer. Yeah.
Okay. Another question, which container plants do you recommend for shade? They don't specify whether they mean veg or ornamental, but
Yeah, like I love hostas, you know, I really like hostas, and I'm kind of saying hostas because hostas are also edible. They're a delicacy in Japan, and we just think of them as ornamental plants. Now, the problem is you're in competition with the slugs for the hostas, but the fact that you're growing them in a container plant, you can put a layer of Vaseline around the outer edge, which the slugs and snails can't really climb over, or you can put copper wire. Now, you can get craft copper wire that people use for making stained glass. It's sticky on the back, and you can put a thread of that around it. That gives slugs and snails an electric shock, so they shouldn't get up and get in. Now, that said, slugs and snails are it's like Steve McQueen on the bike in The Great Escape. They'll get to where they need to get to when they want to get to where they want to get to. But I think hostas are really nice. Any plant, if it's in a shady spot, that's a woodland plant will do. And for most shady gardens are amazing this time of year, because that's all your fritillaries, your snowdrops, your bluebells, all of the shady woodland plants really thrive and perform. It's only when you get into the latter stages of summer can they look a little bit weak. But you always have your kind of annual bedding and stuff that you can stick in that are only there for season to brighten stuff up.
Next question. What are the best perennials for containers? Should they be overwintered on patio or indoors?
Now, you see, again, you're getting into your personal tastes, because like for me, I grow lots of daylilies in containers. Now I grow, again, what we're talking here is we're talking that the flowers have an edible property. They're lovely dipped in tempura batter and fried up and that sort of stuff. They feed an awful lot of insects. They just haven't done well in the type of soil and conditions that I have here. So I'm able to give them the watering that they require and that sort of stuff. A completely different plant to that would be something like the ornamental yarrows, the Achilles, which is like a really kind of dry soil and whatever. But because you're able to amend your pot with the soil, any perennial will cope in a containerized plant. You know, you just got to create the soil conditions for it to grow there. So if you're walking around your garden center, wherever you see is going to grow in a pot, unless it's a shrub or a tree. And then what you got to think is, well, what size is the pot and how long can these roots extend out before they hit the maximum point? And is that going to have an impact on maturity? You know, so, you know, you wouldn't grow a pear tree in a pot, because I mean, you can get kind of patio and miniature apples and miniature pears and that sort of stuff, but you don't get a big yield of them, you know, so you'd probably better off growing them as cordons against the wall. But in terms of perennials, any of the herbaceous perennials, which are the nice kind of leafy stuff with lovely flowers on top, they're all ground for the pot. It's just think about, read the label, what's the soil type, what's the watering aspect, and then it'll just thrive.
Okay. I have a question myself, actually. For somebody starting off for the first time growing veg in a very sunny garden, if they have a choice of a raised bed and container, are there any veg in particular that you'd recommend for a raised bed or a container?
Raised, all veg will triumph in a raised bed, because your raised bed is your way of giving all of the right nutrients straight away, because you're adding in your manure, your compost, your bits of garden soil, and you're making it the best condition for it to grow in. So all veg will do brilliant in that. Not all veg will do well in pots, because again, most veg want access to constant moisture, and that's next to impossible in most pots. Where you'll get it, you know, like if you're growing tomatoes in a pot, that's great because you have a season and then it's gone. You know, stuff like, you know, with your cabbages and your kales and things like that, technically you could try them in a pot and it will be in a different pot or a different soil next year, but it's the watering aspect. When it rains, the rain gets to your soil. When it doesn't rain, the roots can extend down and absorb up. When it's in a container, it's all up to you. So it's really about your level of commitment. You know, do you want to be speeding home because, you know, it hasn't rained in 3 days and you know everything is going to be wilting? You know, it's down to that level. But all of your veg will do brilliantly in raised beds. I would almost say better than in directly into the ground. Now the other thing is, in terms of this, I'm a fan of the no dig. Now, there's times where you have to dig the garden. If there's a waterlogged area, you have to, there's more than likely a hard pan underneath it. You have to go down and break up that so that it becomes free flowing, and then you can be no dig after it. That's the great thing about a raised bed, is you can be no dig. So no dig is just, if you dig over the soil, you can expose some of the good bacteria and the beneficial insects that are in that soil to sunshine or to be eaten by the birds or whatever. If you don't, it all stays inside, and the earthworms and the kind of the microfauna that are in there work the soil beneath. So all you're doing each year is you're top dressing. So that's the other great thing about raised beds, is that raised beds enables you to be no dig and to not subtract from the garden and only ever be adding in, which is ultimately beneficial for vegetables.
Yeah. The last question here, it's a great one, Fiann. Somebody asked if it would be possible for you to show us the garden at some stage before the course finishes, because it sounds amazing.
We might try that again as it gets, what would I say, as it gets kind of brighter and stuff like that. It might be easier to go out. I was trying to do something from the garden the other day and the signal just kept cutting out. So the way the signal cut out earlier, that's the only thing I'd be worried about. I'm quite close to a police station with lots of masts and pylons on the stuff, so even when I go on the phone and I go outside, it kind of cuts out. So I have to figure out how to do that, but it might even be a case of just doing some photographs and doing some slides.
Yeah, we might have a go at that at maybe towards the end of the last session or something. Yeah. Well, listen, thanks a million. There's been so much
weed
to digest. Yeah. That's been brilliant as usual, and we've only 2 more left in the series, I'm sorry to say, but anyway, next week Fiann will be talking about plant diversity and also a little bit more about plant selection. So thank you so much. Apologies for the slight glitch in the middle, and looking forward to seeing you, Fiann, and everyone next week. Good night. Bye.
Great stuff. Good night, everybody.